to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm your host, John, and following on from last Wednesday's episode, Stupid Evil, today we're going to think a little bit about corporate evil. So, as I've said, I was thinking about last week's Stupid Evil episode and evil sort of parties and NPCs in general and the various different types of villain. I've touched on this before on my YouTube channel, but I was thinking, it'd be interesting to potentially, rather than like the evil necromancer or the evil warlord or something like that, maybe have a little bit more of a sort of middle management villain, I suppose you could call them. We're pretty much used to, in D&D, villains posing a number of different threats to the PCs. Either they're going around like killing people and despoiling the land, but they're a serious combat threat. They might have arcane might at their disposal, which needs to be taken into account, or they may have hordes and hordes of henchmen and creatures at their beck and call that the player characters need to fight their way through to get to the big end bad guy, so to speak. But not all sort of bad guys need to be like that. And I was thinking that the sort of officious middle manager or taxman might make an interesting change of pace if they were to be used as a villain in your D&D game. Now, before I go any further, let me just say this might not work for every group. If you've got a group who play in a game world where they're not really bothered about the consequences of anything, they're just going to kick this guy's door down, storm in with their broadswords and hack him to pieces, then the middle management / tax collector villain probably isn't going to work very well. However, if your campaign world leans a little bit more heavily into the consequences for actions and is a bit more sort of grounded, I suppose you could say, if that's the right term, then you might get a lot of mileage out of this. So, what are the main characteristics of the tax collector or middle management villain as I see them? Well, first of all, they're in a position of some authority. So if we look at tax collectors, they collect money off people on behalf of normally a noble or someone higher up who has a great deal more power, and they sort of speak on behalf of their master or their lord when it comes to finances, collecting taxes, and stuff like that. So if you have a world where consequences are a very real and present thing, if you just burst through the door when this guy's giving you trouble and hack him to pieces, the noble lord who relies on him to collect his taxes and whatever isn't going to be too pleased. Now obviously the length of their displeasure and the measure of it is going to depend on how much they actually value their employee. I mean, if they hate them, they might be like, oh, it's a minor inconvenience, I've got to employ someone else. However, if they really get on with this person has some special skills or links to them that they can't easily replace, well, then the PCs are probably going to reap a much more dire set of consequences. As well as having the powers of his master in certain areas, the tax collector or middle management villain also has the ability to levy taxes, collect monies and stuff like that. They normally also have access to guards or people who can enforce the collection of such monies. Now these low-level thugs or whatever probably aren't going to pose a threat to high-level adventurers. I mean, they might do for low-level adventurers, so that could be a thing in itself, but for high-level adventurers, they're not really going to cause them much trouble. Again, though, if you just kill them, there are potentially consequences, and also, if you keep killing all these low-level thugs, eventually the tax collector is going to use some of the money that he collects and that he's granted by his lord in order to hire some more proficient people to take care of the player characters and to teach them a lesson. And these could even be other adventurers. So the player characters might find themselves facing down a party of very similarly leveled adventurers that have been hired by this disgruntled middle manager or tax collector. If you wanted to make it particularly poignant, perhaps it's some adventurers they've met previously who they get on with, but these adventurers are all about the money, and now they're in the employ of the tax collector, and he says he wants them to go and rough the player characters up a bit to make it clear that he doesn't appreciate them killing his low-level goons. Another way in which they can come across this tax collector or middle management villain is the fact that player characters probably don't actually pay tax, but every lord or sort of person of high status in the sort of standard pseudo-medieval D&D game is probably going to want to get their money from the peasants under their control. Also, they're probably going to take a tax on any trade goods coming into their city or town or whatever. They may even say that, you know, if a treasure is discovered in a dungeon within so many miles, then a percentage of it has to be paid in tax to the crown or whatever the authority is called in your game. And it's going to be the tax collector who collects that. Now, I'm sure that you're aware of like many sort of rich people in the real world who have got into trouble for like not disclosing all of their expenditure and not paying all the tax. And they generally get levied with a pretty massive fine and maybe even jail time or a bit of a slap on the wrists, depending on the circumstances. And this could easily be ported into the D&D game. So let's say the player characters have been merrily collecting treasure from dungeons for the first 5 levels or so, and then suddenly they get to their lodgings. Maybe they bought a house, maybe they're in a tavern or whatever, and they find a note there from the local tax collector or someone in his employ telling them that they owe 20,000 gold pieces in back tax because they've not been paying their dues over the course of the first 5 levels. Now, it may seem a little bit unfair to like spring this on the players if you've not mentioned it previously. However, perhaps they can work out some sort of deal with this tax collector, you know. Perhaps he needs some slightly higher level people to go and collect taxes from other people who've been evading them. And if the player characters help him out, he's maybe willing to waiver or reduce that amount that they owe. So in this case, it could all be flipped around and the player characters find themselves in the perhaps uncomfortable position of going to people who maybe can't afford to pay the ridiculously inflated rate of tax, and they're the ones sent in to rough them up and collect the taxes off them. Maybe the tax collector, a shipment of tax revenue was coming in and it was diverted by bandits, or it was captured by monsters or something like that. And the tax collector's maybe got the general area where it happened, but he's only got low-level goons. He was going to hire some people, but he floats it towards the player character saying, oh, if you can go and recover all this tax revenue for me, I'll waive the costs of the back tax that you actually owe to me. So you could drop a few plot hooks in there for future adventures. Now, your tax collector type villain probably doesn't really have any sort of massively like physical or magical powers. Although if you wanted to add a sprinkling of those in, you obviously could, whatever suits your campaign. Their main powers, aside from the ear of their master, is that they probably have access to large sums of money, and depending on the whims of their lord and the local law, they may have a considerable amount of discretion as to how that money is spent. And if you look at, I don't know, like a superhero like Batman, whose main power is, oh, I've got an obscene R&D department and a bucket load of money, and think of all the shenanigans he gets up to and all the bizarre tech he's got under his control, then it's not difficult to see how a motivated person with maybe a bent towards the sinister and access to large amounts of money could cause a lot of problems for PCs. After all, if the PCs threaten him with magic, maybe he can go and hire a sage to research some magical protection. Maybe he goes and hires a mage himself. And you can bet if the characters outfox him in one situation, the next time they come up against him, he'll have spent some of his vast resources to try and find ways to counter whatever particular things that the player characters were throwing out. And also, the second power of the tax collector is that they're pretty much protected by law. If you burst in and just shank him when he's just been doing his job and trying to collect the tax money, then you're going to be on the receiving end of like the town guard, city guard, whatever, and stuff like that. And in a game with consequences, you could quickly find yourself on the run from the local authorities with potential imprisonment and all the other various consequences that brings. So there we are. There's a few thoughts as to why I think a middle management or tax collector could be a potentially interesting villain for a campaign. Like I say, your mileage may vary depending on how you deal with consequences and how heavily you lean into that in your campaign. But I hope at least it's been interesting to listen to me ramble on about it. If you've got any thoughts about this or any other episodes, please do get in touch and you might be featured in a future voicemail episode. You can get in touch by sending us a voicemail to SpeakPipe or Anchor, link in the description down below, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. So until we see you again, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun.